He thought he was above the law. But in one reckless moment, a cop's decision would destroy not only an innocent man's life, but his own. Just 2 minutes after making an arrest, everything changed, and the man in uniform lost everything. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this video, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future updates. It was just another ordinary afternoon in the city, with people hustling through the streets trying to finish their errands before the day ended. The sun was high, the air warm, and the usual sounds of car horns and street chatter filled the air. For Marcus, a regular guy on his way home from the store, it seemed like any other day. He'd just bought a few groceries, nothing unusual. He was walking down the sidewalk, lost in thought about the dinner he was about to make, when he noticed the flashing lights of a police car pull up behind him. Without any warning, the officer in the car stepped out. Officer Harris. At first, Marcus didn't think much of it. Maybe the officer was just stopping to ask something or make sure everything was okay. But when Officer Harris called out to him, Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach. "Hey you, stop right there," Harris shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. Marcus turned, confused. "Is something wrong, officer?" Harris didn't respond kindly. "You're under arrest for trespassing. Step over here." Marcus was taken aback. He hadn't done anything wrong. He wasn't on private property or breaking any laws. He was just walking home like everyone else. His mind raced as he tried to figure out what was happening. He tried to explain himself, but Harris wasn't listening. "I didn't do anything wrong, officer. I'm just trying to get home," Marcus said, trying to stay calm. But Harris wasn't interested in hearing him out. Without any warning, Harris grabbed Marcus's arm and yanked him towards the car. Marcus pulled back, his confusion turning into frustration. "What is going on? Why am I being arrested?" he asked, his voice shaking. The officer didn't answer. Instead, Harris got even more aggressive, shoving Marcus towards the car. People nearby started noticing, and a few onlookers began pulling out their phones, sensing that something wasn't right. Marcus tried to stay composed, but the situation was escalating fast. He didn't know it yet, but this moment would change everything. In the next few minutes, Marcus's life and Officer Harris's career would both be changed forever. As Officer Harris forcefully pulled Marcus toward the patrol car, the crowd around them began to grow. The tension was thick in the air. People whispered, some exchanging nervous glances, unsure whether they should intervene or just stay out of it. Marcus, still trying to make sense of what was happening, felt his heart race. He hadn't done anything to deserve this treatment. Yet the more he tried to explain, the angrier Officer Harris seemed to get. "Stop resisting. You think I'm playing with you?" Harris snapped, his voice harsh. The grip on Marcus's arm tightened, and the officer shoved him against the side of the police car. Marcus, still in disbelief, tried to speak up again. "Please, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just trying to get home," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if trying to reason with the officer's rage. But there was no reasoning with Officer Harris. The more he tried to hold on to his composure, the more Harris seemed to lose control. The officer's anger flared up, and without warning, he slammed Marcus's hands behind his back and cuffed him roughly. People watching from a distance began to murmur in disbelief, but no one stepped forward. They knew what happened when you challenged a cop, especially in this neighborhood. It was easier to just stay silent and hope things would resolve themselves. Just as Harris was about to shove Marcus into the back of the patrol car, a voice cut through the chaos. "Hey, what the hell is going on?" a man shouted from the crowd, his phone held high, recording the scene. The officer froze for a split second, and then, in that moment, something shifted. A small part of Harris's confidence cracked. He looked around, seeing the phone in the man's hand, and his face twisted in frustration. For a brief moment, Harris hesitated. But then, as if deciding it didn't matter, he turned his attention back to Marcus, dismissing the crowd as if they were invisible. Little did he know, that phone, that single recording would be the key to everything. Marcus, still in shock, finally managed to say something he hadn't thought he'd have to. "You're making a mistake, officer. I swear to you I'm innocent." But Harris wasn't listening anymore. He just shoved Marcus into the back of the car and slammed the door shut, not realizing that his mistake had already been documented for the world to see. Within minutes of the arrest, the situation began to unfold in ways Officer Harris couldn't have predicted. The video of Marcus being shoved into the patrol car spread like wildfire. At first, it was just a few people sharing it on social media. But before long, it hit the local news feeds, sparking outrage from anyone who had seen it. The clip showed the officer's aggressive behavior, the roughness of the arrest, and Marcus's attempts to explain that he hadn't done anything wrong. The video caught the attention of several prominent social media accounts, and soon, hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #PoliceAbuse were trending. People couldn't believe what they were watching. How could an officer act like this in broad daylight, in front of so many witnesses and without any clear reason? Was this really happening? Back at the station, Officer Harris had no idea the firestorm he'd ignited. He was still focused on getting the paperwork for the arrest done, thinking it would be another routine day in the office. He had no idea that within the next few hours, everything would come crashing down. The first sign of trouble came when his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from his partner, Officer Johnson. "The video is all over social media. This is bad. Real bad." Harris froze. The weight of the situation hit him like a ton of bricks. He immediately turned on the news, only to see the video of Marcus's arrest playing on the screen. A news anchor was talking about the incident, with people protesting outside the police department. The anger was palpable. Harris felt his stomach churn. The last thing he expected was to be the subject of public outrage. At that moment, he began to realize the severity of his mistake. This wasn't just a minor misunderstanding that would be swept under the rug. This was different. The city was watching, and this video was spreading faster than he could have ever imagined. He thought of his career, his reputation, and the pressure from his superiors that would inevitably follow. But at that point, it was too late. The damage was already done. By the time the Internal Affairs Department began reviewing the footage, Harris knew that his actions were under intense scrutiny. What he had thought would be a routine day was quickly turning into the beginning of the end for him. His career, his pride, and his future were all hanging by a thread, one thread that he had just snapped with his own hands. The following hours were a blur for Officer Harris. His phone rang non-stop, calls from fellow officers, department officials, and even family members, all trying to get answers. But Harris didn't have any answers. The video was everywhere. It was all anyone could talk about. He tried to justify his actions to himself. Maybe Marcus had been acting suspicious. Maybe he had missed something in the heat of the moment. But deep down, he knew it didn't matter. The damage was already done. The police department acted fast. By the time Harris got a call from his superior, Captain Reynolds, the decision had already been made. "Harris, we're suspending you pending an investigation. You need to come in now," Reynolds said, his voice cold. Harris's heart sank. He was stunned. He had never been suspended before, not for anything. The weight of the words hit him harder than any disciplinary action ever could. Suspended, pending investigation. He sat in his patrol car for a long time after that call, staring at the street outside, knowing he was already being judged. The crowd's outrage, the viral video, the protests, it all felt like it was closing in on him. Harris had never felt so alone. He could already imagine the headlines in the morning news. Police officer caught on video brutally arresting innocent man. He could see the angry crowds outside the department demanding justice. He could feel the pressure mounting from every direction. By the time Harris arrived at the station, things were already out of his control. Officers were whispering in the halls, some giving him sidelong glances. He walked past them, trying to hold his head high, but he could feel the weight of their stares. They weren't looking at him the same way anymore. He could tell they knew the truth. He had messed up. And it wasn't just a small mistake. This was big. Inside the station, Captain Reynolds was waiting for him in his office. The captain didn't waste any time. "We've watched the video, Harris. We're starting an internal investigation. It doesn't look good. This could cost you your job." The words hit Harris like a slap. His chest tightened, his hands clenched at his sides. "I didn't do anything wrong," he tried to explain again, his voice cracking. But the captain didn't respond. Instead, Reynolds gave him a long look as if weighing something heavy. Then he sighed. "You've been a cop for over 10 years, Harris. You should have known better. You're a seasoned officer. You should have de-escalated, not escalated. What happened today? This isn't just about you. This is about the trust people have in the police, and right now, you've destroyed that trust." The words stung. Harris didn't know what to say. There was no defense. There was no excuse. The only thing left was the harsh reality of the situation. His career, the life he had built, was crumbling right in front of him. By the next morning, the story had gone national. News outlets from all over the country were covering the arrest, showing the now infamous video of Officer Harris manhandling Marcus. The public outrage was overwhelming. People from all walks of life were expressing their anger, not just about the brutality of the arrest, but about the blatant disregard for the rights of an innocent person. The hashtags kept trending, and the pressure on the police department intensified. Within the department, the mood had shifted. What had been a group of officers working together now felt more like a team of individuals, each one quietly watching the others. Harris's colleagues, the ones who used to chat with him during breaks, now avoided eye contact. They were all waiting for the inevitable fallout, and as much as they tried to keep their distance, whispers about the incident spread like wildfire through the building. It wasn't just Harris's job on the line anymore. It was the department's reputation. The phone call came early. Captain Reynolds had been briefed by the higher-ups, and now the decision was final. "Harris, we're letting you go," Reynolds said flatly. "Effective immediately." The words barely registered in Harris's mind. His body went numb as the captain's voice continued, outlining the formalities of his termination. Harris stood there in his uniform, trying to grasp what was happening, but it felt surreal. Just hours before, he had been a police officer, a man with respect and authority. Now he was nothing more than a former cop with a ruined reputation. As Harris gathered his things, his mind kept going back to Marcus. What had he been thinking when he made the arrest? Why had he been so quick to react, so eager to prove a point? He should have known better. He should have listened to Marcus when he said he was innocent. But now, it was too late to go back and change anything. By the time he left the building, it felt as if the weight of the world was on his shoulders. As he walked to his car, he noticed the reporters gathered outside the station, cameras pointed his way. He could hear the faint click of shutters as they took pictures of him walking out, his face a mix of defeat and disbelief. His entire career, everything he had worked for, was now reduced to a few moments caught on camera. A career built on years of service had ended in an instant. And it wasn't just his job at stake now. The media had picked up on his personal history, his past arrests, complaints about his conduct, and even rumors of prior instances of excessive force. The video had opened up a floodgate of scrutiny, and Harris couldn't escape it. Everywhere he turned, there it was, his face, his actions, his downfall. He didn't even have time to process what had just happened before the public outcry turned into something else. Protesters showed up outside the police station, demanding justice for Marcus and calling for police accountability. The department had to beef up security, worried that things would escalate further. And amidst all of this chaos, Harris could do nothing but watch as his world crumbled. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had once been the one showing up to control the chaos. Now he was the one who had caused it. As the day dragged on, the public outrage continued to grow. The protests outside the police station intensified. People from all walks of life, families, activists, even people who had never protested before, gathered to voice their anger over what had happened. Signs demanding justice for Marcus were held high, with messages like "No justice, no peace," and "End police brutality" painted in bold letters. The chants grew louder and more forceful with every passing hour. Marcus, for his part, had been released later that evening. The charges against him had been dropped, but that didn't mean the damage was undone. His face, too, had become known to millions. The video of the arrest had already sparked a conversation about police brutality, racial profiling, and the growing divide between law enforcement and the communities they were sworn to protect. Marcus, however, wasn't focused on the public spectacle or the media frenzy. He was still processing the traumatic experience. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But now, he was left with the emotional scars of that arrest, and the fear that such incidents might continue to happen to others. As the days went by, Harris couldn't escape the media storm. Every time he turned on the TV or opened his phone, there it was. His face, his name, his downfall. News outlets ran endless stories about the incident, showing the video on a loop, dissecting his every move. The coverage was relentless. He was called everything from a symbol of police misconduct to a rogue officer. Former colleagues distanced themselves from him, some even commenting publicly that they were disappointed in Harris's actions. The public backlash was so fierce that even his own family began to feel the pressure. His wife, who had always been supportive, barely spoke to him anymore. She had to deal with the judgment and the whispers of neighbors and friends, all while trying to keep their children out of the spotlight. Harris's name was now synonymous with failure and disgrace. The city council had called for an emergency meeting, and demands for an independent investigation into police practices grew louder. Harris was no longer just a man facing consequences for a single mistake. He was a part of a much larger conversation about systemic issues within law enforcement. And the more he tried to avoid the spotlight, the more it seemed to find him. Meanwhile, at the police department, the fallout was still unfolding. Officers who had once been his allies were now questioning his actions. The internal investigation into Harris's conduct was progressing quickly. Surveillance footage from the body cameras, witness statements, and the viral video all painted the same picture. Harris had acted inappropriately, and his behavior had been unprovoked. The more the department dug, the more questions arose about Harris's judgment and past conduct. There were complaints dating back years, whispers of excessive force, and reports of unchecked aggression. It was becoming clear that Harris had built a reputation for pushing boundaries, and now that reputation was catching up to him. The chief of police, desperate to regain the department's credibility, made a public statement condemning Harris's actions and promising accountability. He assured the public that this kind of behavior wouldn't be tolerated, and that the department was working hard to ensure something like this would never happen again. But Harris knew the truth. No matter what the department said now, it wouldn't be enough. His actions had already tarnished the reputation of the entire force. Harris sat in his living room that night, staring blankly at the TV, which was still broadcasting the protests and news about the incident. His world felt like it was collapsing around him. He had always believed that he was doing the right thing as a cop, that his role was to protect and serve, but now he was the one being judged. And the truth was, he couldn't change what had already happened. The career he had spent over a decade building was gone, erased in a matter of hours. The more he thought about it, the more it felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The following days felt like an endless blur of interviews, meetings, and endless news cycles. Harris's name was plastered across every headline, his face a symbol of everything wrong with law enforcement in the eyes of the public. As the days passed, his suspension became permanent, and the decision to fire him was finalized. It wasn't just the department that had turned its back on him. His entire world had shifted. The public, his colleagues, and even his family had all started to see him in a different light. One evening, after hours of trying to avoid the media, Harris finally sat down with his wife, Lauren. The tension between them had been building since the incident. She hadn't said much, but Harris could feel the weight of her silence. It was as if the entire house had been covered in a thin layer of ice. No matter how hard they tried to talk, it always seemed like something was missing. Lauren looked at him, her face tired, a little worn from the stress. Do you even realize what you've done?" she asked softly, the words hanging in the air. Harris opened his mouth to respond, but the truth was he didn't know how to explain it. How could he explain something he still couldn't fully understand himself? "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Harris finally said, his voice low. "I was just trying to do my job. I didn't know it would spiral out of control like this." Lauren shook her head. "That's the problem, Chris. You didn't think. You acted without thinking. You didn't listen to him. You didn't listen to Marcus." Her words hit harder than he expected. It wasn't the anger he had feared. It was the disappointment. It was the one thing he wasn't sure he could live with. Harris rubbed his face, trying to find the right words. "I never meant to hurt him," he said quietly. "I never meant for things to go that far. It just happened." Lauren's eyes softened, but her voice remained firm. "And now you have to live with the consequences. Not just for you, but for him too. And for everything you've worked for. Do you even realize that? What happens next?" Harris didn't have an answer. The truth was, he didn't know what happened next. The fallout from the arrest was too much to handle. The investigation was intensifying, and with every passing day, the department's scrutiny grew. Even if he were somehow cleared of wrongdoing, his career as a police officer would never be the same. The shame was crushing. Harris had always been proud of his work, his role in keeping the streets safe. But now, he was no different than the criminals he used to arrest. He had crossed a line, and no amount of regret or apology could change that. Marcus's face, the way he had pleaded with Harris, the desperation in his voice, it haunted him. He hadn't seen Marcus as a person. He had seen him as a suspect, as an obstacle to his authority. And in that moment, everything that he had sworn to uphold as a cop had slipped away. Later that evening, the phone rang again. It was his lawyer, calling to update him on the investigation. But before Harris could even ask what the next steps were, his lawyer spoke in a tone that he already knew wasn't good. "The department's looking into your history," his lawyer said. "They're reviewing your past conduct, complaints, everything. It doesn't look like it's going to end well, Chris. They want to know if this was an isolated incident or if this is part of a bigger problem." Harris felt the blood drain from his face. He knew what that meant. This wasn't just about one arrest anymore. The internal review was digging into every part of his career, every complaint, every report, and with every new detail, it became clearer. The officer he had been, brash, quick to use force, and sometimes reckless, was now a liability to the department. Harris wasn't just fighting for his job anymore. He was fighting for his dignity, his reputation, and for a future that no longer seemed certain. His thoughts wandered back to Marcus. What did he think now? Was he angry, relieved? Or maybe he was just trying to move on, to forget the whole nightmare ever happened. But for Harris, there was no moving on. Every step forward felt like a reminder of how badly he had messed up. And as the days passed, it became harder to escape the truth. His career was finished. And worse, the person he had wronged had every right to be angry. Harris had no idea how to face Marcus, or anyone else, ever again. As the investigation into Officer Harris's conduct deepened, the pressure only mounted. It was no longer just the department that was scrutinizing him. Public figures, civil rights groups, and local leaders were all weighing in. The case was turning into something much bigger than a single officer's mistake. It had become a symbol of systemic issues in law enforcement. People wanted answers, and they weren't going to stop until they got them. The Internal Affairs Division had already begun gathering all the relevant information about Harris's history on the force. They were looking at every complaint filed against him, every incident where his use of force was questioned. And there were a few. Harris had always brushed them off, telling himself that it came with the job, that sometimes you had to push people to get the job done. But now, those past incidents were resurfacing, one by one, and they painted a picture of an officer who had failed to respect the very principles he had sworn to uphold. The department had also reached out to Marcus, wanting to get his account of what had happened during the arrest. The video, of course, was clear, but they needed a full statement from him for the record. It was no surprise that Marcus agreed to speak. After all, he was no longer just a bystander in this situation. He was at the center of it. His words would carry weight, and they would likely be the deciding factor in whether Harris would face criminal charges. When Marcus spoke to investigators, his account was calm, but every word seemed to carry the weight of everything he had endured. He told them how he had been simply walking home, minding his own business, when Officer Harris approached him. He described how Harris had accused him of trespassing without any real explanation. And then how Harris's tone shifted from aggressive to violent. He spoke about how Harris didn't listen to him, how he tried to explain that he hadn't done anything wrong, and how Harris didn't care. The worst part, Marcus said, was that he had tried to stay calm. But the more he tried to reason with the officer, the more Harris escalated the situation. "It wasn't just about me," Marcus said to the investigators, his voice steady. "It was about how this officer treated me like I wasn't even human. He didn't listen, he didn't care. He just assumed I was guilty because of the color of my skin. And now my whole life is turned upside down. I'm just glad I'm still here to talk about it." As Marcus spoke, Harris sat at home, waiting for any updates from his lawyer. He could feel the weight of his actions pressing down on him with every passing minute. His mind kept going back to that moment when he had grabbed Marcus's arm, when he had chosen to escalate the situation instead of de-escalating it. That moment had been his downfall. It was a split-second decision, but one that would cost him everything. The worst part was that Harris couldn't even defend himself properly. The video of the arrest had already gone viral. It had been shared by thousands of people, many of whom had added their own commentary, expressing their anger and disbelief at the officer's behavior. Harris's side of the story didn't seem to matter anymore. No one cared about his past record or his intentions. The video told its own story, and it was impossible to argue with what people saw with their own eyes. As the days passed, Harris began to realize something else. The longer this dragged on, the more he felt like an outsider in his own life. His colleagues at the station were starting to treat him differently. There was no camaraderie anymore, no friendly banter in the halls. They were all distancing themselves from him, some with subtle gestures, others with cold stares. Harris wasn't just a disgraced cop. He had become a symbol of everything people were trying to fight against. It was as if his entire career had been reduced to a single, unforgivable mistake. Harris sat in his living room, scrolling through the endless social media posts about the incident. He saw Marcus's name mentioned in countless tweets, articles, and news stories. The public had rallied behind him, demanding justice, and rightfully so. Marcus had been the victim here, and Harris had been the one responsible for the harm. The more he thought about it, the more Harris realized that Marcus wasn't just another civilian he had arrested. Marcus was a person who had been treated unfairly, and who now had to deal with the aftermath of his actions. Harris knew there was no way to undo the damage. He couldn't take back the way he had treated Marcus. He couldn't fix what had been broken in the department. And as the investigation moved forward, it seemed like the only thing left for him to do was to face the consequences of his actions. There was no escaping the truth. He had failed, and now he was paying the price. The days seemed to drag on, each one more suffocating than the last. Officer Harris could feel the walls closing in. Every time he left the house, he was confronted with reminders of the scandal. News trucks lined the streets outside the police station. The protests continued outside the precinct, with more and more people joining in, demanding justice not just for Marcus, but for the system that had failed so many. Harris could see the anger in the eyes of the crowd, but also something else, something deeper. It wasn't just about one officer. It was about a system of power that, too often, abused that power to control and intimidate those who were the most vulnerable. The worst part was that the department was in damage control mode. Every public statement made by the chief or the mayor seemed like an attempt to deflect blame. The message from the department was clear. This was an isolated incident, and it would not be tolerated. But Harris knew the truth. The truth wasn't that his actions were an anomaly. It was that the system itself had allowed officers like him to operate with impunity. He had been part of a culture that turned a blind eye to misconduct, that failed to address the underlying problems that led to incidents like his. The internal investigation continued, and as it did, more and more people began to come forward with their concerns about Harris's past behavior. Several former colleagues spoke about the times they had witnessed his temper, his tendency to escalate situations instead of de-escalating them. Some even mentioned how they had seen him use excessive force in the past, but they had never reported it, either out of fear of retribution or because they felt the department would cover it up. Now, those same colleagues were speaking out, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. It didn't help that the media continued to hammer away at the story. News anchors replayed the arrest video over and over again, dissecting every frame, every moment of aggression. There was no escape for Harris. Every time he checked his phone or turned on the TV, his face was there, his name associated with one of the most controversial moments in recent memory. It wasn't just the police force that was watching him. It was the whole world. Meanwhile, Marcus had become something of a hero in the eyes of the public. The victim of an unjust arrest had been elevated to a symbol of resistance, a voice for those who felt they were regularly targeted and mistreated by law enforcement. News outlets sought him out for interviews, and the social media world rallied behind him, supporting his claims, sharing his story. But through it all, Marcus remained humble. He hadn't sought out fame or recognition, he just wanted justice. Marcus's decision to speak out had been brave, but it had also opened him up to a new kind of scrutiny. He was no longer just a man who had been wronged. He was now a part of a much larger conversation about police reform, racial justice, and accountability. He knew this, and while he felt a sense of duty to keep speaking out, he also began to feel the weight of it all. The world was watching him too. He couldn't escape the constant reminders of what had happened to him either. But through it all, Marcus kept his focus on one thing, making sure that Harris didn't walk away from this without facing the full consequences of his actions. Harris, like many officers before him, needed to be held accountable. He needed to understand that what he had done wasn't just a mistake. It was a failure that affected more than just Marcus. It affected the whole community. For Harris, the moment of reckoning was coming. The internal investigation was nearing its conclusion, and with it, the department was beginning to make its decisions. It was clear that Harris's career was over, but what remained uncertain was whether criminal charges would be filed. The more the investigation uncovered, the more Harris began to realize that it wasn't just his job that was at risk now. His entire future, his freedom, was hanging in the balance. And no matter how hard he tried to hold on to the idea that he had acted in good faith, the evidence was overwhelming. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. As Harris sat at home that night, staring at the same news footage of his arrest of Marcus, he couldn't help but feel like he was drowning. His career was over. His reputation was in tatters, and worse, the person he had hurt the most, the man he had unjustly arrested, was now demanding accountability, and rightly so. Marcus deserved justice, and Harris knew that he was the one who had to pay the price. The decision came down like a hammer. Officer Harris's internal investigation was complete, and the findings were damning. The department had already made it clear that his actions were inexcusable. The excessive force used during Marcus's arrest, the complete disregard for protocol, and his failure to de-escalate the situation were all clear violations of departmental rules. But what made it worse was his history of similar incidents, each one swept under the rug until now. What had once been small complaints about his behavior had now snowballed into a full-blown crisis, one that Harris could no longer deny or escape. The police chief made the announcement early one morning. Officer Chris Harris has been terminated from the force, effective immediately, the statement read. His actions do not reflect the values of this department, and he will no longer serve as a law enforcement officer. Harris couldn't bring himself to watch the announcement. He already knew what it would say. The words stung, but they didn't surprise him. He had known his fate since the moment the video went viral. The department had no choice but to sever ties with him. The public outcry, the pressure from activists, and the scrutiny of the media made his position untenable. They had to make an example of him. But even though he had expected it, even though he knew this was coming, the reality of losing his career was still hard to grasp. It wasn't just about the badge. It was about the identity that he had built for himself over the years. Harris had always seen himself as someone who upheld the law, someone who made the streets safer. He had prided himself on being a good officer, a man who had earned the respect of his peers. Now, in an instant, it was all gone. The weight of the situation hit him hardest in the quiet moments, when he was alone with his thoughts. It wasn't just the career he had lost, it was the trust he had broken. Harris had spent years trying to convince himself that he was a protector, someone who stood on the right side of the law. But now, he had to face the truth. His actions that day were a betrayal of everything he once believed in. He hadn't protected Marcus. He had harmed him. He had abused his power and used his authority to intimidate someone who was innocent. Meanwhile, Marcus, though still dealing with the aftermath of the arrest, found himself at the center of a movement. He wasn't seeking fame, but the world had turned its attention to him. Activists from across the country reached out, offering support. News outlets continued to cover his story, framing him as a victim of police brutality but also as a symbol of resilience. People began organizing for reform, and Marcus's name became one of the many rallying cries for justice. It was clear that, despite everything that had happened to him, he had become a voice for something bigger. But Marcus wasn't focused on the spotlight. As he continued his fight for justice, he kept thinking about what it would take to change things for good. He knew that Harris's termination wasn't enough. It was a step, sure, but it wasn't the end. It was part of a larger problem, one that needed fixing from the ground up. No single case, no matter how high profile, would change the system overnight. But if his story could help spark change, if it could lead to real reforms in how police officers were held accountable, then maybe there was hope. Harris, on the other hand, was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life. The termination was only the beginning. With the department's decision to fire him, criminal charges were now a real possibility. The video had made it clear. Harris had acted outside the law. The district attorney's office was reviewing the case, and it was only a matter of time before they decided whether or not to press charges. As if losing his career wasn't enough, now Harris was faced with the very real prospect of facing legal consequences for his actions. In the quiet of his apartment, he thought about what it would mean if he were charged. What if he went to jail? What if his life as he knew it was destroyed for good? The thought consumed him. There were no easy answers, no way to undo the damage he had caused. All he had now was the fallout, the broken trust, the ruined reputation, and the haunting question of how he could have allowed things to get so far. It was clear to Harris that the consequences of his actions weren't going to end with his firing. The storm was far from over, and he was only beginning to understand just how deep the damage ran. As the days turned into weeks, Harris's world became smaller. The public firestorm was not over. It only seemed to grow with each passing day. News outlets, social media, and protesters, everyone continued to scrutinize him. Every time he left his apartment, he felt the weight of people's eyes on him, as if they could see the failure etched on his face. His family, too, felt the strain. His wife, Lauren, had withdrawn even further. The arguments had become more frequent, the silence between them more suffocating. They were barely speaking anymore, and even when they did, it always seemed like the same question hung in the air. What now? Harris had spent years convincing himself that being a police officer was his calling, his purpose. But now, all that was gone. The badge he wore, the uniform, everything he had identified with for so long no longer had any meaning. All he had left was the crushing guilt that came with knowing he had hurt someone. An innocent man who had done nothing to deserve the treatment he received. But it wasn't just Marcus. Harris's actions had affected his entire family, his colleagues, and the community he once thought he was helping. He had damaged the trust that people needed to have in law enforcement, and it felt like that trust would never be repaired. Meanwhile, Marcus continued his fight for justice, and Harris could do nothing but watch. He had heard from his lawyer that criminal charges were now being seriously considered. The investigation into his actions was not just an internal matter, it was now a criminal case. The footage from the bystander's phone, showing Marcus's rough arrest and Harris's aggression, had become the key piece of evidence. And it wasn't just that. There were the past complaints about Harris's conduct, the previous incidents where he had used excessive force, all coming to light. The more they dug into his record, the more it seemed like Harris had been skating by for years, shielded by the system. Now the truth was out, and he couldn't hide from it. Harris's lawyer, a man who had been trying to manage the mess of the situation, finally called with the news that Harris had been dreading. "The district attorney is filing charges," the lawyer said, his voice flat, as if he were reading from a script. "You're looking at possible assault charges and misconduct in office. If this goes to trial, it could get ugly. And even if you're acquitted, your life, your career will be over. There's no coming back from this." Harris sat in silence as the weight of the words settled over him. The criminal charges felt like the final nail in the coffin. It wasn't just that he had lost his job. Now his freedom was at risk. The department had already severed ties with him, but the courts could take everything else. It was hard to imagine what his life would look like after all of this, whether he would ever be able to hold his head up again. He had crossed a line, and now the consequences were more severe than he had ever anticipated. As Harris prepared to face the legal consequences of his actions, the community's response was mixed. For some, the charges were a step toward accountability, a small victory in the long fight for justice. The protests continued, and calls for police reform grew louder. There were those who believed that Harris's firing and the potential charges against him were just the beginning, that systemic issues needed to be addressed before real change could happen. For them, this was a symbolic victory, one small example of how the system was being held to account. But for Marcus, the situation was far from simple. The attention he had received, both positive and negative, was overwhelming. He had never wanted to be a symbol, never wanted to be thrust into the spotlight. He had just wanted to go home that day, to get on with his life. But now he was part of a much larger conversation, one about race, justice, and policing in America. The media loved a good story, and his story had become a rallying cry for people who felt like they had been ignored for far too long. Marcus had been interviewed by so many reporters, so many news outlets, that it was hard to keep track. The questions always seemed to circle around the same theme. How did it feel to be the victim of police brutality? What did you want to see happen to Officer Harris? He answered them all with the same calm composure, but internally he was struggling. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every black person who had been treated unfairly by the police, about every person who had been subjected to racial profiling or brutality. Marcus knew that this case could serve as a turning point, but he also knew that the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. He wasn't sure what justice looked like anymore. He wasn't sure what would make things right. For all the media attention and public support, Marcus couldn't escape the pain of that day, the feeling of helplessness as he was manhandled by a man who was supposed to protect him. He couldn't forget the way Harris had treated him, like he wasn't even human. Justice wasn't just about convicting Harris. It was about changing the system that allowed things like this to happen in the first place. As the legal proceedings moved forward, Marcus focused on the bigger picture. The world was finally paying attention, but there was so much more to do. There were still countless stories like his, stories of people who had been wronged by those who were supposed to protect them. And until things changed on a fundamental level, there was no real victory to celebrate. Not yet. For Harris, the path ahead seemed clear, but it was not one he was eager to walk. He had no illusions about his future. He had made his choices, and now he had to live with them. The legal battle was just beginning, and whether or not he was found guilty, it would be a long time before he could escape the shadows of his own actions. His career was over. His reputation was shattered. and the question of whether he could ever find redemption, whether he could ever look in the mirror and be proud of the man he saw, was something he wasn't sure he would ever be able to answer. The trial loomed over Harris like a dark cloud, each day bringing him closer to a confrontation he had spent weeks dreading. The district attorney's office had made it clear. They were going after him with everything they had. The video footage, Marcus's testimony, the mounting evidence from previous complaints. It was all stacked against him. Harris's lawyer tried to prepare him for the worst, advising him to expect a conviction, especially given the public sentiment. The media circus surrounding the case wasn't helping. The public had already decided. The trial was no longer just about one officer's actions. It had become a referendum on police brutality, on the very relationship between law enforcement and the communities they served. As Harris sat in his lawyer's office reviewing the case, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything had spiraled out of control. This was no longer just about him. This was bigger than one man, one mistake. His entire career had led to this moment, the moment when he realized how fragile his life as a police officer had been. He had been a cog in a system that many felt was broken beyond repair. Even if he managed to avoid jail, he would never escape the public shame. There was no going back. His name would forever be associated with the viral video, with the anger and frustration of so many people who had watched it unfold. The media coverage of the trial became increasingly heated. It wasn't just the sensationalism of the police scandal anymore. It was the fight for justice, for a system that could no longer afford to turn a blind eye to the actions of a few bad actors. The courtroom was packed with protesters, supporters, and onlookers, all hoping that this case would be a turning point. They wanted Harris to be held accountable, but they also wanted something more, a change, a promise that no officer would get away with abusing their power again. Inside the courtroom, Harris sat rigid, trying to hold his composure. Marcus was on the witness stand, and Harris couldn't help but watch as the man he had wronged recounted the details of the arrest, his voice steady and firm. Every word felt like a slap in the face. Harris had never truly understood the weight of what he had done until he heard Marcus speak. The frustration, the fear, the helplessness in his voice. It all cut through the room like a knife. Marcus wasn't just telling his story. He was speaking for everyone who had ever been mistreated by the police, everyone who had suffered at the hands of an officer like Harris. But as much as Harris tried to focus on the proceedings, a part of him couldn't shake the thought that no matter what happened in that courtroom, he had already lost. Even if the jury found him not guilty, the verdict would be irrelevant. He had lost his job, his reputation, and his place in the community. But worse, he had lost his own sense of who he was. The trial finally came to a close after weeks of tension. The jury deliberated for hours, the weight of their decision hanging over the courtroom like a ticking clock. Harris sat there, the dread slowly building in his chest. The outcome of this trial would determine not just his freedom, but his legacy. Would he walk out of that courtroom a free man, or would he face the consequences of his actions? It was a question that had kept him awake at night, and now it was time for an answer. When the jury returned, the air was thick with anticipation. Harris's hands were clammy as he gripped the edge of his seat. The judge called for silence as the jury foreman stood to deliver the verdict. The room seemed to hold its breath. We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Chris Harris, guilty of assault and misconduct in office. The words hit Harris like a punch to the stomach. For a moment, everything around him seemed to fade. He could barely hear the rest of the judge's instructions as the reality of the conviction settled in. He had been found guilty. There was no escaping it now. The man he had wronged, Marcus, had won, and Harris had lost everything. The courtroom erupted in mixed reactions. Some people cheered, relieved that justice had been served. Others remained silent, their faces stoic, as if they too understood that this wasn't just about Harris. It was about a much larger issue. Marcus's supporters, who had been fighting for accountability for so long, were now seeing the first real step toward justice. But for Harris, there was no sense of victory in the air. There was only the crushing weight of defeat, the realization that his entire career had crumbled under the weight of his own actions. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following week, but Harris knew that the damage had already been done. The trial had shown the world what kind of officer he had been, and it wasn't the kind of man anyone wanted to be associated with. He had lost his career, his integrity, and his freedom. The road ahead would be filled with legal battles, media scrutiny, and, most likely, time in prison. But the hardest part, the part that would haunt him for the rest of his life, was the fact that he had no one to blame but himself. The system had failed him, but it had also failed Marcus. And the pain of knowing that he had been the one to perpetuate that cycle of violence and injustice was something Harris wasn't sure he could ever live with. The sentencing was the final blow. Harris was handed a prison sentence, not just for the assault on Marcus, but for the years of misconduct that had finally come to light. The judge, who had listened to the testimonies and reviewed the evidence, made it clear that this wasn't just about one mistake. It was about a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long. Harris had broken the law, but he had also broken the trust that the public placed in their police officers. As the judge passed down the sentence, Harris's thoughts were numb. He had known it was coming, but hearing the words out loud still felt like a punch to the gut. Chris Harris, you are hereby sentenced to 5 years in prison for assault and misconduct in office. Your actions have damaged the trust in the police force, and you must pay for the harm you have caused. The room seemed to tilt as Harris's lawyer gave him a brief glance of sympathy before turning his attention to the legal papers in front of him. The reality of it all hit Harris like a tidal wave. He was going to prison. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked for was gone. In its place was a sentence that would strip him of his freedom and force him to confront the magnitude of his actions every single day. Outside the courtroom, the reactions were mixed. Marcus, who had been a quiet, powerful presence throughout the trial, was met with applause as he walked out, his supporters cheering for the justice they had fought so hard to see. He wasn't celebrating Harris's downfall. He was celebrating the fact that the system had worked, that accountability had been achieved, and that maybe, just maybe, this would be the first step toward real change. But Harris didn't feel like celebrating anything. He felt only a deep sense of loss, a sense of regret that nothing could undo the pain he had caused. As the handcuffs were fastened around his wrists and he was led away, he realized that he had to live with the consequences of his actions for the rest of his life. There would be no redemption, no easy way out. The system had worked, but it had worked too late for him. And now he would have to face the consequences alone. As Harris was escorted out of the courtroom, the weight of the chains on his wrists felt like an unbearable reminder of how far he had fallen. Each step, each movement seemed to drag on as he was led down the hallway to the holding cells beneath the courthouse. The sound of his footsteps echoed against the cold walls, a stark contrast to the noise of the courtroom just moments before. The cheers, the jeers, the weight of the public eye, all of it was gone now. All that was left was the reality of his actions and the life he had destroyed. Inside the cell, Harris stood silently, his back against the cold concrete wall. His mind was numb, still trying to process everything. It wasn't just the prison sentence that haunted him. It was the realization that he had been part of something much larger, something that extended far beyond the scope of his own life. He had been a small piece of a broken system, and now that system had caught up with him. The law, the structure he had sworn to uphold, had turned its back on him. He had violated it in ways that could not be undone. The questions that had been swirling in his mind since the trial seemed to take on a life of their own. What if I had done things differently? What if I had just listened to Marcus, let him explain himself, and de-escalated the situation? Could things have turned out differently? Harris could never know the answer to those questions, and that was what gnawed at him the most. The what-ifs haunted him, but he also knew that he would have to live with them for the rest of his life. The guilt wasn't something that could be washed away in a few years. It was too deep, too ingrained in who he had become. In the days that followed, Harris found himself spending more and more time in his cell, thinking about everything he had done, The isolation was a constant companion. Prison wasn't what he had imagined. He had expected it to be harsh, but nothing prepared him for the crushing loneliness, the sense of betrayal from those he had once called colleagues, and the shame that followed him everywhere. His lawyer had warned him that he would be facing time in a high-security facility, a place where former cops weren't exactly welcome. He would have to watch his back, keep his head down, and try to survive. There were no visits from family. His wife Lauren had left him soon after the sentencing. The emotional toll of his actions had been too much for her. She had tried to support him, but in the end, the truth was too heavy to bear. She couldn't stay with a man who had caused so much pain, not just to Marcus, but to their family. Harris couldn't blame her. In fact, a part of him understood it. After all, what kind of future could they have now? What kind of relationship could they rebuild after everything that had happened? And then there was Marcus. Harris had heard from his lawyer that Marcus was doing well, that he had used his newfound platform to speak out about the need for police reform. He was still advocating for change, fighting for a system where people like him, innocent men who were targeted because of their race, wouldn't have to live in fear of being brutalized by the very people who were supposed to protect them. Harris had followed Marcus's journey from prison, reading the articles, watching the interviews, seeing the progress that had been made in the fight for justice. The irony was that Marcus, the man he had wronged, was now leading the charge for the change Harris had failed to see when it mattered most. The world outside was shifting. People were paying attention to the conversation Marcus had started, the one that so many people had been silenced from having. Harris couldn't help but feel the sting of his own failure, knowing that he had played a part in that silence. He had been one of the people that had perpetuated the very systems he was now watching crumble. And in that, he realized the full extent of his mistake. It wasn't just about the arrest. It was about a larger issue that needed addressing, an issue he had been too blind, too stubborn to see. Weeks turned into months, and Harris spent more time reflecting than he ever had before. The regret was constant, and yet, there was something else that began to grow inside him, something he wasn't sure how to deal with. Could he ever make amends? Could he find a way to contribute to the fight for justice, to help right the wrongs he had caused? He didn't know. Maybe there was no redemption for someone like him, but the idea of simply serving his time and walking away with nothing but his shame didn't sit right with him. Harris's cell was his only companion now, and in that isolation, he started to do something he hadn't done in years. He started to listen. He listened to the stories of the other inmates, to the pain and frustration they carried with them. He started reading books about the history of policing, about systemic racism, about the stories of black men and women who had been mistreated by officers like him. Each story he read, each story he heard, felt like a mirror being held up to his face. And the reflection staring back at him wasn't someone he recognized. Somewhere deep down, Harris knew that his journey wasn't over. Prison would be his reality for the foreseeable future, but it was also where he would face the hardest truth of all. He had to change. For the first time in his life, Harris understood what it meant to truly be held accountable, not just by the justice system, but by himself. And the hardest part was that he couldn't undo what he had done. The damage had already been done to Marcus, to his family, to the community he had betrayed. But maybe, just maybe, through self-reflection, he could find a way to make things right, in whatever small way that might be. Whether it was finding a way to advocate for change from within the prison system, or sharing his story to warn others, Harris realized he had to do something. For now, though, all he could do was sit in the quiet, his thoughts his only company. Months passed, and Harris's life in prison was slowly taking shape into something that felt unrecognizable. The days were long, filled with monotonous routines, and the constant hum of an oppressive reality that wrapped itself around him like a thick fog. The guilt was always there, but as time went on, it became something he could not escape. It wasn't just the weight of his conviction or the hard walls of the prison that defined his days. It was the heavy presence of his own conscience. Harris had become a different man in the sense that he was now living with a clarity he hadn't had in years. There were moments, in the silence of his cell, when his thoughts would wander back to the day he arrested Marcus. The brutality of it, the confusion on Marcus's face, the way his resistance had been met with violence instead of understanding. Every time the memory resurfaced, it felt like a fresh wound. But over time, those wounds had begun to heal, not because they were gone, but because Harris had started to face them, to dissect every decision he had made that day. He had been so blind, so arrogant, so convinced that his badge gave him the right to control the situation, to dominate it, without any thought for the man standing in front of him. But Marcus had been a person, a human being with hopes, dreams, and a right to live his life free of fear. Harris had ignored that. He had violated that, and he was paying for it now. In the early days of his sentence, Harris had been consumed by anger. Anger at Marcus, anger at the system, even anger at himself. But the anger eventually faded, replaced by a deep, aching sorrow. He would never be able to undo the damage he had caused. But in the long, quiet hours of his confinement, Harris had come to understand that sorrow wasn't enough. Regret, as powerful as it was, couldn't be the end of the story. If there was any hope for redemption, it would come from action. Real, concrete action. One of the things that had struck him the most was the way the other inmates had responded to him. At first, he had been isolated, a former cop in a prison where many had experienced firsthand the brutality he had represented. He was hated, mistrusted, and treated like an outsider. His name had spread through the facility like wildfire. He was the cop who had brutalized an innocent man, and in this place, there was no forgiveness for that. He had been threatened, harassed, and avoided by most. But as time wore on, he began to notice something unexpected. Some of the inmates had begun to listen to him. They wanted to hear what he had to say about the arrest, about the way the system worked, about his views on law enforcement and the injustices people like them had suffered at the hands of officers like him. Harris didn't know how to feel about this newfound attention. On one hand, he felt a strange sense of responsibility. Maybe this was his chance, his one opportunity to make a small difference, to start paying back the debt he owed. On the other hand, he knew he didn't have the right to stand in front of anyone and preach about justice, not after what he had done. The hypocrisy was suffocating. But despite his internal struggle, he began to speak out, tentatively at first, but over time, more openly. He started small, sharing his experiences, acknowledging his failures, and openly discussing how his own actions had harmed not just Marcus, but the community, the department, and the very people he had sworn to protect. He spoke about the mistakes he had made, the systemic issues that allowed officers like him to go unchecked, and the deep rot that had taken root in the very institutions meant to serve justice. It wasn't easy. The inmates didn't just accept him. They challenged him, questioned his motives, and called him out on his past. But for Harris, the challenge wasn't just a way to defend himself. It was a way to finally begin confronting the man he had been. The man who had abused his power, who had thought that the badge was a shield from accountability. And little by little, he began to see a change, not just in how others viewed him, but in how he viewed himself. Harris still couldn't undo what he had done, but he could take responsibility. He could work to understand the harm he had caused and commit to being a part of the conversation on reform, even from inside the prison walls. One evening, sitting in the dim light of his cell, Harris found himself writing. He had started keeping a journal, a place where he could put down his thoughts, his regrets, his hopes. It wasn't much, but it was something. He wrote about Marcus, what he imagined Marcus's life had been like after that day, what his own life might have been had he not made that fateful decision. He wrote about the fight for justice, about police brutality, about systemic racism, and about how he had been a part of that system. He wrote about the inmates he had met, men who, like him, had made mistakes, but who had also seen the flaws in a system that failed them time and time again. In one of his journal entries, he wrote, "I never thought I'd end up here. I never thought I'd be the one paying the price. But I am, and I deserve to be. I took away someone's dignity, and now I'm paying the price for it. But maybe, just maybe, I can use this time to make it right. Not for me, but for the people I hurt, for Marcus, for all of them. The more he wrote, the more he realized that his journey toward redemption wasn't going to be a linear one. There would be no quick fixes, no easy answers. But what he had begun to understand was that change, real change, had to come from within. The system wasn't going to fix itself. People like him, officers, lawmakers, citizens, had to make that change happen, one decision at a time. And maybe, just maybe, he could contribute to that change, even from prison, even after everything he had done. But the road to redemption was still long, and Harris wasn't fooling himself into thinking that a few words or actions could erase the years of harm he had caused. He would have to live with his mistakes for the rest of his life, but he wasn't going to let those mistakes define him forever. In the silence of his cell, Harris finally understood what it meant to truly face the consequences of his actions, and it was the hardest thing he'd ever had to do. Years passed, and Harris's life inside the prison walls became something far different from the life he had once known. He had become a man defined not by his badge, but by the scars of his past decisions. The prison had forced him to confront the reality of who he was, the mistakes, the arrogance, the brutality, and to slowly, painfully begin the long road to understanding. His days were no longer filled with anger or denial, but with quiet reflection and a determination to change, even if it was in the smallest ways. Harris knew he would never be free of the guilt, the shame. He knew that no matter how many journal entries he wrote, no matter how many conversations he had with fellow inmates about justice and reform, he would never undo the harm he had caused. But he could change. And, perhaps more importantly, he could try to make a difference, no matter how small, for the people he had wronged. The system that had once protected him, that had allowed him to operate without consequence, had also failed Marcus, and countless others like him. That reality weighed heavily on Harris every day. The more he spoke with the other men in the prison, the more he understood how many of them, like him, had fallen victim to the very system they had once thought would protect them. There were men here who had been victims of over-policing, racial profiling, and a broken justice system. Some had made mistakes, yes, but others had been caught up in a system that showed them no mercy. Harris had become a reluctant listener, hearing stories of violence and unfair treatment, and for the first time, he was no longer the one standing in judgment. He was the one listening, the one trying to make sense of a system that was failing so many. One afternoon, after a long conversation with an inmate who had spent years fighting a wrongful conviction, Harris sat in his cell and felt the weight of everything he had come to realize. He had been on the other side of the badge for so long, standing as a representative of the law. But now, he was standing on the other side, hearing the stories of those he had once judged. Some of these men had been victims of the same system that had protected him, and it dawned on him that he, too, had been a victim, just not in the way he had ever imagined. He had been part of a system that needed to be fixed, but had been too blind to see the cracks until it was too late. Harris started to think about Marcus, the man he had wronged. He had seen Marcus's name in the news, watched as he became a figurehead in the fight for justice. He had heard the rallies, the speeches, and the growing momentum for police reform. But what struck him the most was the quiet strength Marcus had shown in the aftermath of his wrongful arrest. Marcus hadn't sought revenge. He hadn't been consumed by hatred or anger. Instead, he had turned his pain into a weapon for change. Harris had watched from prison as Marcus worked tirelessly, not just to seek justice for himself, but to push for systemic change. In his journal, Harris wrote, "Every day I think of Marcus, of what he's done since that day. I think of how he took the worst thing that could happen to a person and used it to build something better. How many times have I seen people try to break him, to tear him down, but he keeps standing. Maybe that's what justice looks like, not just in the courtroom, but in the way we live our lives, the way we fight for those who have been wronged. I can't change the past, but If I can learn anything from Marcus, it's that I can still make something out of all this. Even if it's just being honest with myself and trying to listen to those I ignored for so long. Over time, Harris had begun to find a small sense of peace. It wasn't peace in the way most people would think of it, not a peace of mind or freedom from consequence, but it was a kind of peace that came from knowing he was finally taking responsibility for the man he had been. He wasn't excusing his actions. He wasn't trying to justify them. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But in prison, he had started the long process of listening, of trying to understand, and of slowly acknowledging the bigger picture. One day, a prison social worker came to talk to him about a community outreach program designed to teach inmates about the justice system and how they could help push for reform. It wasn't a path Harris had ever considered, but as the worker spoke about the potential for change, Harris felt something stir within him. Here was a chance to be part of something bigger than himself. He wasn't sure how far he could go, how much impact he could have from behind bars. But he knew that this was something he could do. It wasn't redemption. There was no redemption from what he had done. But it was something, a step however small in the right direction. Harris signed up for the program. He started talking to other inmates about what he had learned, about his own journey of self-reflection, and about the importance of understanding the system that had failed them. The more he spoke, the more he realized how much he had to learn and how much he still didn't know. But he also knew that there was no going back now. He couldn't unsee what he had seen. He couldn't forget the faces of the men and women he had wronged, and he couldn't ignore the cries for justice that continued to echo in his mind. Months turned into years, and Harris's transformation was slow but real. He still struggled with the weight of his past, but he knew he was different now. The road he had traveled had been long, painful, and filled with consequences he could never escape. But it was also a road that had, in some ways, taught him what it meant to truly confront himself, to listen, to learn, and, perhaps most importantly, to be part of the change that was needed in a broken system. In his final journal entry, Harris wrote, "I'll never forgive myself for what I did to Marcus. I'll never be able to take it back. But maybe I can help others see what I couldn't. Maybe, somehow, the lessons I've learned can help someone else avoid the mistakes I made. That's all I can do now. That's all any of us can do, start from where we are and try to make a difference no matter how small." It wasn't a redemption story, and it wasn't the happy ending Harris had once imagined for himself. But in those quiet moments, behind the cold walls of the prison, Harris had found something that, for the first time, felt like peace. A commitment to change, a willingness to listen, and a desire to help others find the same freedom that he had taken for granted all those years ago. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and make sure to subscribe for more videos like this. Thanks for watching.